voiceover program, but to have the opportunity to just sit down with a pen and paper without anything in front, a clean desk, a nice clean desk, and just to write down the shitos, and to try to see the sugya in its totality, to see it steadily and to see it whole, as Matthew Arnold wrote in Sophocles. So I thought the best thing to do is for us to just read through the Gemara again without looking at any of the Rishonim, and we'll just have the great joy, the first period, just of reading the Gemara again and say, oh, what did the Rif say on this line? How did the Ramban say on that line? And then of the second period, we'll just go through the Mikoros Chazara that I draw up for you. Just it's all known to you already, of course, but just certain things that I highlighted there. And if you review the packets that are online, you should be in line for a Chazaka HaMivarer. Establish the reality of your kinyan in the sugya. I'm Rav Yehuda Amarav Abodei Tzarech Sheyivatel. Immediately, my time Yinema Mishum Perurin. It's a little crumbs left over. Hello Chashivi. So there's no possibility of violating by Yerah by Yamatzeh anyway. So why would you have to do Bittul Chametz? Tachisema Kevan Deminter Lehu Agavese Chashivi. That even if objectively they're not chashav, context can impact their understanding of what the Perurin are. That since they're in the context of a house, which is chashav, so that grants chashivas the perurin vatanya. Sufei te'enim, if you're at the end of the fig harvest, mishamar sadeh b'fnei anovim, sufei anov mishamar sadeh b'fnei b'kshos, b'fnei b'dlos, b'zman shabal ba'albayis makbid aleihem. It all depends not on shmira for something else, but if the balabayis is makbid on that particular species of growth. And for purposes here, on the Perurin, Bizman Shabalabayis Makbid Aleim Asur Mishum Gezel V'Chayav Meiser, Bizman Shein Balabayis Makbid Aleim Mutar Mishum Gezel B'Tur Mishum Meiser, and in that sense, there's no Chashash Abal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh Mishum Perurin. Halo Chashivi, it sounds like in the Gemara, Halo Chashivi is a din in the Gavra. The Gavra doesn't consider then Chashav. Amar Rava, so Rava says, Gzeira Shema Yimtza Gloska Yafa V'Da'asei Ilave. And remember we saw that Rashi and Tosfos disagreed how to interpret that line. Rashi said that there would be some what are you guys doing right now? Good, hesitating, right? So there'd be some hesitation, and in that hesitation there'd be an Isser Bal Yirah Bal Yamatzeh. So Rashi L'Shitasa Daf Daled Amid Aleph, Daf Daled Amid Beis. How many times has Rashi explained that the Isser Bal Yirah Bal Yamatzeh is triggered when it's Rotze B'Kiyumo? So that instantaneous Rotze B'Kiyumo V'Dasei Ilave. So then the Gemara says, V'chi Mishkachas Liv Talei. So Tosfos says, if you read like Rashi, it's very difficult to understand. The whole point is that he delayed, right? So that's why Tosfos says, no. Shema Yamsa Glosa Yafa V'Dasei Ilave means that it's not something which is automatically batel as opposed to the Perurin. Excellent, Avi. Right, so that Tosfos reveals a little bit later on in the Gemara the way that he understood the line of Halo Chashivi was not like Rashi understood that it was a din in the Gavra, but Halo Chashivi means that objectively they're batel. They're objectively batel because they're just not significant. So Amar Rava Shama Yimtza Gloska Yafa V'Dasei Ilave V'chi Mishkachas Liv Talei. So fine, so you do Bittul Chametz whenever you find it. Dilma Mishkachas Levasar Isura. That to perform Bittul Chametz, it needs to be under your ownership. By the way, that was why the Balei Tosfos, despite very substantial problems raised by the Ran and others, that's exactly why the Balei Tosfos took the position that Bittul Chametz was synonymous with Hefker. Because Ein Adam Mafker Davar Sheinu Shelo, Ein Adam Mevatel Davar Sheinu Shelo. So they saw shades of Hefker in this line of the Gemara. Okay, you don't have to understand it that way, but that's part of the. Now that you guys have a semester of Orler Abbas are under your belt, you just appreciate these nuances so much more. Each line, right, how that impacted the general sweep of the Rishon. V'lav b'rishusay kama v'lo metzi mivdal. Damar Abelazar shnei dvar menad b'rishuso shel adam v'asal kasav ki'ilu b'rishuso. Asana kasav ki'ilu b'rishuso for purposes of having responsibilities, liabilities. Ve'elu hein bor b'rishus harabim b'chametz misheisho sulamala. That the Torah says that chametz after chatzos and a bor b'rishus harabim, despite the fact that you're no longer they're no longer under your ownership, you still have liability. So for bor, it's the inyan nizikin, and for chametz, it's the inyan bayira bayimatze. Now, this is not to say that bayira bayimatze starts at the 7th hour after chatzos, as we know. The Rambam doesn't believe that. Perhaps Rashi and the Ravid do. We saw evidence for that. But v'chametz v'sheisha u'sulamala. So here, clearly, and we'll pick up at this in a second, when the Gemara says chametz misheisha u'sulamala, what does it mean? From after the 6th hour, exactly. That will become the primary line of attack of Rabbeinu Tam against Rashi on Zayin Amud Aleph. So, Einan B'Rishus Shel Adam. Who remembers the diuk here that we made in Rashi, where it would have been enough for Rashi to say that Bor B'Rishus Harabim is not B'Rishus Shel Adam because it's in the Rishus Harabim. But how did Rashi learn it? Rashi felt that wasn't enough to say, Daniel? Yeah, exactly right. It's a very fascinating thing that Rashi would introduce the concept of hefker. So now the Gemara says, "V'nivtalei be'arba, v'nivtalei be'chamesh." So again, taking as a template the Gemara's insistence that you do bittul chametz that night right away. So the Gemara is trying to push it back ever so slightly. So what about the next morning? V'nivtalei be'arba v'chamesh. Who remembers which Rishon departed exactly at this point of the Gemara? Yehuda Kozlo remembers. Very good. The Rif plays in the opposite direction. He says, no. First the Gemara swings for the fences. The Gemara wants to say, how late can you do it? And then it circles back to Arba v'chamesh. Our Gemara builds up a little bit more steadily and says, okay, well, if it's not going to be at night, what about the morning, the 4th hour, the 5th hour? So here we found maybe the most difficult line in the entire Gemara. So the Gemara says, Kevan delav zman isurahu v'lav zman bi'urahu dilma pasha v'lo miftolei. That somehow you're not going to remember to do bittul chametz because it isn't asur yet, either midaraisa or derabbanan, and you're not being mivared yet, and somehow you're just not going to remember to do bittul chametz. It's very difficult to understand what exactly this meant. So we tried to say at the time that maybe one thing that the Gemara had in mind, Binyamin, is very good. So that just as the Ran says that people, have questions about bittul chametz, how effective can this really be? Can I just hocus pocus, wish my chametz to become Ka'afra da'ara, so maybe in that sense, what the Gemara is built is on a kind of a substratum of skepticism about bittul chametz. And people aren't going to really be taking this very seriously. Okay, that was a very challenging line in the Gemara. So then the Gemara says, okay, fine. Dilma pasha lo miftale v'niftale b'shis. So what about the 6th hour? Right? There's no isur daraisa. So the Gemara says, Kevan de isura derabanan ilavei Kid oraisa damya v'lav birishuse kayama v'lo matzi miftal. The 6th hour is also not subject to bittul chametz because kid oraisa damya. Now, which Rishon that we saw really does great justice to this idea that the 6th hour is kid oraisa damya. Jacob? Yeah, he sure does. In the utilization of which term? It's always an expansion of a doraisa. Always an expansion of doraisa. Carry that with you the rest of your life. And don't satisfy yourselves when you're learning a Rambam, and you used to see the term divrei sofrim. The first question you have to ask the Rambam is, which doraisa is he expanding? It may be obvious, it may not be obvious. Maybe you have to work very hard for it. So, for the Rambam here, it's quite easy, because who does the Rambam paskin like Kodem Zmano? Rabbi Yehud. So there's a Nisa Daraisa of Achila, Nisa Daraisa of Hana, Kodem Zmano. So Chazal pulled that back. So the way to read this line of the Gemara, V'nivtalei b'shis, Kevan di Isura derabanan ilavei, Kidda Oraisa damya, the rabbis fashioned or extended the Isur Daraisa into the 6th hour, V'lav b'rshusei kayam v'lo matzi miftal. And here is where all the troubles began. The Amar of Gidel, Amar of Chia bar Yosef, Amarav. Let's first read this line according to Rashi, then Rabbeinu Tam, then the Ramban. We'll go through all three Girsos in the Gemara. The Amar of Gidel Amar B'chia Bar Yosef. We'll obviously start with Rashi. It's the easiest and smoothest read of the Gemara. Hamikadish Mishesho Sulamala Afilu B'chite Kordenaisa Ein Choshesh in the Kiddushin. How does Rashi mark render the Gemara? Smooth. That we're still talking about the 6th hour. And just like in the 6th hour, one cannot perform the act of Bittul Chametz because the Chametz is no longer under your ownership, so too the Kiddushin is not effective in Choshen the Kiddushin because the Chavta Shel Kiddushin is not under your ownership. Now, why is the Chavta Shel Kiddushin not under your ownership? There's an Isser Hanoah D'Rabbanan. So how does Rashi formulate that? Rashi has a very complex, Rashi's reading of the Gemara is the smoothest, but Rashi has the most complex explanation as to why we're not Choshesh for Kiddushin. It's actually a 2-step explanation. Meish, number 1, and then number 2. Very good. Very good. We'll return to that point. So that ultimately, we're not suggesting that this doesn't have the status of Mammon, or it doesn't have Shava Pruta. What are we suggesting according to Rashi? That we're dissociating the Mammon from the Gavra. The Gavra Mekadesh, not the Isha HaMekudeshes. We're salting the connection between the Gavra and the Shvei Pruta. It continues to exist, but it's not his. That's why, again, which question? You'll be Mesader Kiddushin. Tachas Avusecha Yuvanecha. Mechubed Mesader Kiddushin. Rabbi Davis, Hollywood, Florida. Ben Beno. So what will you ask? Which 2 questions will you ask under the chuppah? First you ask the Eidim, they're related to each other. You can ask them that beforehand. Is a Chavsa and? Well, not yours. It's yours, that's a problem. You may walk out of there not being the Mesader Kiddushin, but the Mekadesh. Whole different issue. Could happen. So, we'll talk about that the first sugya of the next month, when we talk about Birchas HaMitzvah. Okay, very good. So you have to establish both of those ways. That's how Rashi reads the Gemara. Let's try to read the Gemara according to Rabbeinu Tam. The Amr of Gidel Amr B'chia Bar Yosef Amarav HaMekadesh Mishesho Salamala Afilu B'chite Kordenaisa in Choshesh in the Kiddushin. How did Rabbeinu Tam learn the Gemara? Tani. How did Rabbeinu Tam read that line in the Gemara? Right, so just take us further. So Rabbeinu Tam says, we're dealing with Bittul Chametz. Can I be Mevatel my Chametz in the 6th hour? Do I own it in the 6th hour? And the answer is no, I don't own it in the 6th hour. There's Nisar Hanad D'Rabbanan. Kidda Oraisa Damya, it's no longer under my ownership. And the Gemara says, and this is comparable to which situation? Very good. So that there's an Issa D'Rabbanan, not Sha'os D'Rabbanan, but the Chavta D'Rabbanan of Chametz Nuksha, and there, that also suffices to take the Chametz out of my possession for purposes of being Mekadesh the woman. Okay, that's how Rabbeinu Tam. Again, the advantage to Rabbeinu Tam, what's the advantage, Dani, to Rabbeinu Tam's reading? What led him to this conclusion?
Because according to Rashi, interpretation, Kiddushin isn't the best fit.
Shlomi?
The words afilu that you did with those?
Even stronger. Jacob? Mishesho Sulamala means after Chatzos. Okay. What's the weakness of Rabbeinu Tam's reading of the Gemara? That ultimately, you always ask, what's the Gemara talking about? What's the Gemara trying to prove? The status of Chametz in the 6th hour. And he's left discussing the status of Chametz in the 7th hour. Okay. Now the most difficult reading of them all, which Rishon has the hardest time in terms of reading the Gemara? I'm not saying he doesn't have his reasons for it. What's the third girsa in the Gemara? I don't mean girsa in terms of a different text, but approach. The Ramban? Exactly. So the Ramban has a very difficult reading of the Gemara. So let's try to read that Gemara according to the Ramban. The Amar of Gidol Amar B'chia Bar Yosef HaMarav HaMekadesh Mishesho Sulamala Filu B'chite Kordnais and Choshen L'Kiddushin. How does the Ramban read that line in the Gemara? The Ramban. Yonatan? How does the Ramban read that line in the Gemara? The most difficult reading of them all, Yehuda. So he says that when the Gemara says, we want to find out the status of the 6th hour. Chametz is no longer in your possession, you can't do bittul chametz. So how can I prove that? Because when it's chametz d'Rabbanan in the 7th hour, it's not considered your chametz, we're not going to be choshesh or kiddushin. But if it were in the 6th hour, we're always choshesh or kiddushin. The Ramban ends up in what I call the pretzel, that the 6th hour for purposes of bittul chametz, the chametz is not in your possession. But the 6th hour for purposes of kiddushin, even if you're dealing with chametz gamar daraisa, it's absolutely in your possession. And the Ramban gives which svara? He says,
does it make sense that 5 minutes later you wouldn't be kosher?
Asi the mishrei yeshesh liyalma. So the Ramban pays a heavy price to protect a very worthy cause of Asi the mishrei yeshesh liyalma. We don't want people, taking that lightly. That's an Isser Misa. At the same time, it's a very difficult read of the Gemara because, at least according to Rabbeinu Tam, right, there are cases in the 6th hour where we're not choshesh for kiddushin. According to the Ramban, we've drawn a hard and fast distinction between bittul chametz and kiddushin within the 6th hour. So those are the 3 shitos in terms of reading the Gemara. Rashi has the smoothest read of the Gemara. Okay? The smoothest read of the Gemara. Rabbeinu Tam has a slightly less smooth reading of the Gemara, but he has that redeeming factor of Mishesho Sulamala. The Ramban has by far the most difficult reading of the Gemara, but he has his reasons for it of Asi the Mishrei Yeshesh Liyalma. He's trying to protect against people not taking Kiddushin seriously in the 4th and 5th hour. By the way, how did the Ritva formulate the Ramban's concern? Marasayim. People are going to be confused. Jacob and Binyamin.
Can you walk through the Ramban?
Sure. So the Ramban says when the Gemara is trying to prove that chametz is not in your ownership during the 6th hour for purposes of bittul chametz. The Amar of Gidol Amar B'chia Bar Yosef Amarav HaMekadesh Mishesho Sulamala, so that when it's in the 7th hour and beyond, Afilu B'chite Kordnaisa, the chametz is not in your rishus for purposes of kiddushin, in choshesh and the kiddushin. So just like after the 6th hour, if there's an Isser D'Rabbanan, an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan, so that can remove the Chametz from your Rishus Leinin Kiddushin, so too, if there's an Isser Zman D'Rabbanan in the 6th hour, that can remove the Chametz from your possession for purposes of Bittul Chametz. But the irony is that according to the Ramban, if what we're talking about is the 6th hour and your ownership of the Chametz, for the Ramban, there's an ironclad distinction between Kiddushin and Bittul Chametz. Because for the Ramban, if you ask us, is the Chametz sufficiently in your possession to be mevatel it during the 6th hour, the answer is no. If you ask the Ramban, is the Chametz sufficiently in your possession to be mekadesh with it during the 6th hour, the answer is a definitive yes. So what a strange Gemara then. If the Gemara sought to prove that the 6th hour, the chametz was no longer under your bailus, what a strange and confusing citation to cite from a Gemara which, according to the Ramban, establishes that in the 6th hour the chametz very much is in your bailus. If this was an English essay, right, your teacher would mark, confusing, poor transition. But the Ramban has his reasons for it. Asi the Mishrei Yeshesh Liyalma. Yes. Binyamin and then Ben Zion.
So, just to make sure I understand, so what Tosfot is saying is that if there is an aspect of Deoraita in either timing or the Chametz, then we're for sure not Choshesh for Kedushin, and maybe if there's only Derabanan, then he doesn't say, alright, but it's possible, then he would say
pure Derabanan, it's possible that we are Choshesh for Kedushin. That's the Ran's interpretation of Rabbeinu Tam.
But Ramban is saying that because chametz is inherently reliant upon timing. If even the time is derabanan, then forget what the chametz is. That's all. It might as well be all derabanan, and then we're choshesh for kiddushin.
So the Ramban says even if it was chametz deoraisa in the 6th hour, we're choshesh for kiddushin.
But could that be reliant on the fact that chametz deoraita?
He says it's because 5 minutes before, in the 5th hour, this would be a clear situation of kiddushin. And he says it's just too close for comfort. That's his svara. Even though the Ritva calls that marasayan, it's not really marasayan. It's the idea that when it comes to isurim chamurim, you need some protection. That's the idea. So 3 different girsos in terms of reading the Gemara. And Sion.
So all these cases are where you missed bittul?
So person should have done bittul immediately following B'dika. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Merava Bodek Tzarech Shivato. And the Gemara wants to know why exactly there's an impetus in the Gemara to do bittul chametz immediately following B'dika. So the Gemara raises various possibilities. Maybe I could do bittul in the 4th hour, the 5th hour, the 6th hour. So the Gemara here isn't necessarily dealing with somebody who forgot, but just l'chatchila. Why wouldn't I do bittul in the 4th hour? Why wouldn't I do bittul in the 5th hour?
Bittul, then it's not in your possession.
Well, that's true. So if you achieved bittul already the night before,
So whole case wouldn't count.
yeah, the Gemara here is just, this is the primary Gemara. The Gemara is figuring out the optimal time for bittul chametz. So the Gemara wants to know why Rav thought it was appropriate to do the night before. Now the truth is, we saw for many Rishonim, quoted Agos Maimonios, and a very substantial number of Rishonim, our practice, you do both. Right? Who remembers the 3 reasons the Rush gave for that? Shlomo, just enumerate the 3 reasons why it is we would do both. The bittul that we do at night is only meant to cover chametz she'ena yadua, right? And let's say you left over from the chametz that you have. Number 2. Very good. And maybe even the chametz that you had the night before that you were mevatel, somehow you reacquired it. Okay. Very good. Jacob.
The way we just explained the Ramban, I feel like it fits very well with the town because, like we have said that there's a problem with the town, which the Ramban kind of answers that problem while presenting his own issue.
Yeah, what I'm trying to sensitize you to right now is just, when all is said and done, and you appreciate all the shitos in isolation, you should be able to read the Gemara and sort of feel the bumps along the road, right? There's no doubt that for Rashi, the Gemara reads smooth, right? It raises other questions, like, well, what about Mishei Shao Sulamala? That term really is a craw in his throat. And a little bit, as was suggested before by Shlomi, that Afilu B'chite Kornais, it's not clear why Rashi has to say that. Maybe once Rashi was looking to express the idea of the scope of Kol Mekadesh Adaisa the Rabbanim Mekadesh. But what I just want you to be sensitive to is now that you've seen all the Rishonim, to just go back to the basic text of the Gemara and see the pros and cons. That's what learning is all about, is how many times you're going to make a textual trade for conceptual gain. How many times do you make a textual and a conceptual trade for a halachic gain? Basically the Ramban's argument here about being choshesh or kiddushin b'shas shishis, even with chametz gamor, the Ramban's argument is not a textual argument, and it's not even a conceptual argument. It's a halachic concern. Asi lemishrei yeshes liyalma. It's too close for comfort. Rafael.
Right, so if you're in Kaddish Mishnah chametz in the, that's the 6th hour, even if one of those who said you want to be choshesh for kiddushin, wouldn't she have to destroy the chametz? How's that working? She's going to destroy it within an hour.
So just give me the case again. I heard half of your comment. Go ahead.
So, basically, the Gemara comes Rashi, Kaddish, and you show with chametz, it's already in the 6th hour.
Right?
You don't bring it on bond, you said that it is mutter, it is choshesh and kiddushin.
Right.
Wouldn't she have to destroy the chametz
Sure.
within an hour? So how is that working?
How is that?
How is that considered shabbat pruta? It's not worth anything. She's going to destroy
The
it.
question is, what about at the time?
It's not worth it.
Why do you say?
Because for something to have worth, you have to consider using it in the future or having value to you.
So we're going to come back to that next. We're going to come back to when we review the shitas about Rabbi Shimon next period. But just be aware of the assumption that you're making. Right? You're making a major assumption about what it means for something to have value. I see a box of ring dings in the supermarket. It says this will expire tomorrow. Is it a value today? What's that?
So you eat the ring and buy it.
Okay.
So it means she has to do chametz.
She may not need to actually eat it, but the bottom line is that it was something from which hana could be derived right now. So just be rigorous about your assumptions about what something is, how you define something as a matter of hana.
So does the punctuation mark she has to be able to derive hana from it means she actually has to derive hana from it, or she just has to be able to derive hana?
Oh, good. So remember we read the Tshuva Sarashba, that was exactly the point that he was taking up. Remember when he was mechalik between Ma'arvin L'Nazir B'Yayin Yisrael B'Truma versus an Isha that was Nodaris Hana from a certain individual. We'll go back over that case. So he says she has to be able to extract Hana Mamish. But I think even according to the parameters of the Rashba, which are fairly restrictive, she could extract Hana now. That's very important. Okay, so that's just in terms of reading the Gemara, which I wanted to go over and do with you. So I distributed the sheet, just in addition to all the sheets you have online. I just thought it'd be nice to sit down and write up for you a little bit of a tour through the sugya, just to help you guys put everything together. So to appreciate our sugya and Daf Zayin that we just reread, we needed to take a gander over at the Gemara in the second parak on Daf Kaf Ches. There the Gemara presents a fundamental machlokas Tanoim about what the nature of the Isser Chametz is. So we had three shitos. The shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that Chametz is only machalos asuros, there is no Isser Hanoah. Now it's possible to explain that as it's an Isser Gavra. The Gavra isn't allowed to eat the Chametz. There's no Isser that adheres in this particular Chatzah. No Isser against deriving Hana from this Chatzah. Can't eat it. So that applies to Rabbi Yossi Aglili even on Pesach. That's one way to learn Rabbi Yossi Aglili. On the other hand, there are Rishonim who suggest that even Rabbi Yossi Aglili considers it an Isser Chatzah, in the sense that it has to be destroyed. There is a Chi of Tashbisu. But the Isser Chatzah doesn't extend so far as creating a formal Isser Hana. Fine. The second sheet in the Gemara was the Mina Katzel HaKatzah, the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that there are three different Isurim when it comes to Chametz. Kodem Zmano, meaning on Yedalad, Toch Zmano on Pesach, and the Achar Zmano after Pesach in perpetuity. They're all Isurim in the Araisa. They all carry along with them in Isser Achila and in Isser Hana. The Rambam happens to paskin like Rabbi Yehuda Kodem Zmano, as does the Tur. As we saw, the vast majority of Rishonim paskin like Rabbi Shimon, both Kodem Zmano la'achar Zmano. What was the sheet of Rabbi Shimon? Kodem Zmano la'achar Zmano eino over alav below klum, toch Zmano over alav belav v'kares. Okay. So, one of the most interesting lines we saw in all of the Rishonim that we studied vis-a-vis this machlokas was, it seems clear that no matter who you hold like in terms of the Tanoim, that there's some basic difference between Chametz on Erev Pesach and Chametz on Pesach. See, even if you take the position of Rabbi Yehuda, that there's a considerable Isser stigma against Chametz on Erev Pesach, how do we know that it's different than Chametz on Pesach? Kares. Excellent. So which Rishon really diminished that? Which Rishon really, much to our surprise, in his rendering of the sugya, not the Baal Ma'ar, who said that there has to be an Isser Hana even according to Rabbi Shimon Kodem Zmano, because that's the nature of the Isser Toch Zmano. Avi? Not the Ravid. Very good.
And the rabbi says the Rabban because since Shimon is following Rabbi Yehuda,
That's the Ravid.
Yeah, the Ravid. So he holds this in
No, but the Chiddush here, the Maram Chalava, is he doesn't go in that direction. He didn't say Mid Rabbi Yehuda Nishma Rabbi Shimon. He said something far more shocking. He says, if the Isser Toch Zmano is an Isser Achila with an Isser Hana, that it has to be parallel to that in Erev Pesach. That I thought was shocking. That's the Maram Chalava. Try it enough times. It's right twice a day. So that's a very big chiddush. The vast majority of Rishonim reject the assumption of the Maram Chalava. The vast majority. Okay, so give me 1 second. We'll just establish the overview and then pause again for some questions. So you have this machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We already spoke about that Rabbi Yehuda's position is endorsed by the minority of Rishonim, the Rambam and the Tur, but the vast majority of poskim, the Rishonim, they hold like Rabbi Shimon, the Ravid, the Milchamos, the Baal HaMa'ar, the Baal HaIter. The vast majority of Rishonim paskin like Rabbi Shimon, bein lifnei zmano, bein la'achar zmano. But the question is, of course, what does Rabbi Shimon hold? What is his shita? So the Baal HaMa'ar will tell you, if you want to know his shita, read the Gemara. Which line in the Gemara is the Baal HaMa'ar keyed in on? Daniel Weber? Kodem zmano eino overlove below klum. There are no isurim. Hence, we're choshesh l'kiddushin. Now, it's true, even the Baal HaMa'ar admits that Rabbi Shimon thinks that there's a mitzvah say in terms of how you should deal with the chametz, namely tashbisu, exactly. But that doesn't translate into an isser achila, let alone an isser hana. She'ein lecha, ein lecha shbasa gedola mizah. So of course we're choshesh kiddushin, not just in the shashishis, Shashaviyis, all the way until Shkia. Ain't overlove below klum. Which Rishon in Chachmei Sfarad neutralized that line? Daniel. Excellent. So how does he interpret ain't overlove below klum? But say that you correct. I'm very proud of you. Quoted the Rishon exactly, but just put it into conceptual terms. What does he really think that means?
He's saying that.
Of course, there's an Isra Achila Doraisa, but
no addition. When it's boom, no addition.
Right. That whether or not you eat it is not the mechayiv. What sugya does this remind us of that we spent a lot of time on, where we tried to figure out what is the defining mechayiv in a particular area? Avi? Lav sheish bo ma'isa, lav shein bo ma'isa, right? So the applications of lo sachmo, lo yiro fanai reikam. It's the basic idea that Rabbeinu David is articulating here, is that the mechayiv isn't your achilas chametz, according to Rabbi Shimon. The mechayiv is something fundamentally passive that you failed to be mashbis the chametz. You were derelict in your chi of tashbisu. That was the mechayiv. So when Rabbi Shimon says "Eino overla below klum," it doesn't mean that it's mutter ba'achila. Of course, it's aser ba'achila, but the question is, what's the mechayiv? The mechayiv is you have to destroy this. And that's a very important line in Rabbeinu David. Rabbeinu David takes on the central raya of the Baal HaMa'ar. But in terms of the psak of the Baal HaMa'ar, that there is no aser achila da'araisa, so that the Rabbeinu David, of course, is not alone. The Ravid, the Bali Atosvos, the Ramban, they all dispute that. So the Chiyav Aseh of Tashbisu, or if Rabbi Shimon is deriving on the basis of Lo Sishchar al Chametz Dav Zivchi, Lo Sishchar is a Pesach Hadayin Chametz Kayim, like the Ravid says in the Hasagos on the Rambam. So Tashbisu automatically translates to Nisra Achila Da'Raisa. Automatically translates. Now, here, as you can see in the chart, these Rishonim differed as to whether there was an Isser Hanoah D'Rabbanan or not. So, which one of these group of Rishonim, the Ravid, the Ramban, the Balei Tosos, was clear that there is an Isser D'Rabbanan of Hanoah? Dani? Excellent. Outstanding. And why does he say that? What's his rationale?
That you can't just have an Isser D'Oraisa without like a stepping stone.
An Isser D'Oraisa V'Achila has to be paired at least to an Isser Hanoah D'Rabbanan. Okay, good. Number one. Number two. Rafi? Yeah, the construct of Rabbi Yehuda in the 6 hours is basically the construct of Rabbi Shimon after Chatzos. And then he says, V'kol shekain. What's the kol shekain? Because Rabbi Yehuda in the 6 hours, Isser Achila is only Isser D'Rabbanan, whereas Rabbi Shimon's Isser Achila after Chatzos is Isser D'Oraisa. And then the Ravid appeals to a third principle. He thinks that what's triggered by the Chi of Tashbisu, the Chi of Tashbisu is linked inexorably Yehuda to beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Dani, Yehuda, Rafi. You're in the Ravid. You're in the Ravid. You don't just like have a general sense. He disagrees with the Baal Amar. You're in the Ravid. That's what we're going for here. That's excellent. Now, Tosos and the Ramban do not subscribe to an Isser Hanoah. How do I know? Somebody bring me the case that both Tosos and the Ramban cite, which demonstrate that there really is no Isser Hanoah according to Rabbi Shimon. La'achar zmano, after Chatzos. What was the case? Mark? Right, so you have to destroy it. So let's say I choose to destroy it by using it as fuel. So if there's a Isser Hanoah, so of course that wouldn't be allowed. But how do the Milchamos and the Balei Tosfos, why do they say that's Aser? Not because of an Isser Hanoah, but because Gzera Shema Yochlanu. So what we pointed out in Shir is that the remarkable thing, according to the Balei Tosos, the Ramban, and Rabbeinu David as well, in this regard, is even though they don't have a formal Isser Hanoah, it's obvious to them that we're not Choshish for Kiddushin. You don't need the Isser Hanoah to be Ma'akev the Kiddushin. All you need is the fact that this object needs to be destroyed. Rafi, that was what you were insinuating 10 minutes ago. If you're going to have to destroy this, how could it be an object of value? We'll pick it up there after the break. That's exactly the underlying logic of Tosos, the Ramban, and Rabbeinu David. So you don't need an Isser Hanoah to be Ma'akev the Kiddushin. What you need is an obligation to destroy this. Rafi? So in halacha we speak in terms of chal, or creation of halachic reality, or an iko of something which impedes, creates an obstacle in that halachic reality. So the person who's talking about kiddushin, what you have to have is an ish, an isha, and when you're dealing with kiddushin kasef, you have to have a chavta shel kiddushin. And those elements have to be organized with certain choreography. In other words, the kasef or the shvei kasef, shvei pruta, has to be in the possession of the ish. He has to give it to the woman. Eidim are a factor here to observe it. And it has to be his shava pruta. So that there are multiple lines of attack that can prevent this new halachic reality from being generated. So let's say one of them is that you don't have a chavta shel kiddushin. Ba'inan shvei pruta v'leka. So maybe what an Isser Hanoah is, even an Isser Hanoah d'Rabbanan, is the rabbis are saying, since you can't benefit from this, it doesn't have the status of mammon. The Shiltei Giborim, the Ritva, the Meiri, the Avnei Miluim, and the Beis Shmuel, all formulated things in these terms. You can't extract benefit from something. So it's possible to say that doesn't impact the chavtza, it only tells you something about the gavra. But it's equally possible to suggest that because the gavra is unable to extract the benefit from this particular chavtza, the chavtza loses its status as mammon. And we explored that approach extensively. Now, there's another way of analyzing the obstacle here in the Kiddushin, which is not to attack the value of the Chavtza Shel Kiddushin per se, but the association between the Mekadesh and the Chavtza Shel Kiddushin. What would that be?
Another? Or
Not the Mekadesh, not the Mekudeshes. The Mekadesh. If Kiru Mamono. This is Mamo. The Chavtza Shel Kiddushin is pristine, intact. The problem is it doesn't belong to the Mekadesh. And we saw that svara employed by the Rashba, by the Taz, and in a specific way by Rashi. Rashi utilized that svara as secondary Yaakov to which other svara that would represent the third. Excellent. Called the Mekadesh, Adaisa de Rabbanan Mekadesh, which is not necessarily an assault on the Mammon, which is not necessarily an assault on the connection between the Gavra and the Mammon, but is this kind of an override mechanism that the rabbis retain the right to either stamp or not this Kiddushin as acceptable, with impact on the Deoraisa level. Called the Mekadesh, Adaisa Derabanan Mekadesh. Now, the Rashba cited this as an independent factor. It had nothing to do with Mammon. And automatically then the Rashba expanded it beyond the scope of Kiddushay Kesef to which area? Kiddushay Bia. What did the Rashba say about that? Avi? Rabbanyan Shavi L'chol Be'ilosav Be'ilas Nas. We're not even talking about Kiddushay Kesef. Called the Mekadesh, Yadais the Rabbanan Mekadesh, has a potentially very broad scope, which Rishon is all the way on the other end of the ledger with that. Called the Mekadesh, Yadais the Rabbanan Mekadesh is a surgical strike to be employed only in certain specific places. 3-word expression should come to mind. Heicha de Itmar, the Shita of the Meiri, that called the Mekadesh, Adaisa de Rabbanan Mekadesh, is limited to wherever the Gemara utilized it. So 3 possibilities in terms of what the Ikov is. Is it just a general, you violated a rabbinic dictum, and therefore called the Mekadesh, Adaisa de Rabbanan Mekadesh, we don't recognize this Kiddushin? And therefore it could have application Kiddushay Bia. And what's the other expansion, where we'd expand beyond the Chavtza Shel Kiddushin, Yoni? Where he said, if called the Mekadesh Adaisa Derabanan Mekadesh, if there's some problem here on the Derabanan level that can impact the Kiddushin Midaraisa, that should immediately bring to mind a scenario and a Rishon affiliated with that scenario. Tosos. Shlomo?
Either Nedarana or Psulei Edus Midarabanan.
Psulei Edus Derabanan, the tshuva of the Rif. Right, the tshuva of the Rif. Right, the Rif had a tshuva. Gedolei HaPoskim, the Meiri disputed this, but the Rif said that that's also a problem in terms of called the Mekadesh Adaisa Derabanan Mekadesh. Psulei Edim Derabanan. Okay, so we have again 3 basic approaches as to what the Ikov is, the Kiddushin. Ba'inan Shvei Pruta Veleka, Eno Mamon, the approach of the Arzarua, the Meiri, the Ritva, a broad-based approach of called the Mekadesh, Adaisa the Rabbanan Mekadesh, which is the approach of the Rashba. Rashi employs that, but Rashi employs that in a very different way. Rashi says, once you violated the rabbinic dictum, called the Mekadesh, Adaisa the Rabbanan Mekadesh, gave them license to do what to your mammon? Hem hifkiru mamono. we then turned our attention to trying to push this idea of Isser Hana D'Rabbanan even farther. Right? You could have an Isser Hana D'Oraisa, Basar B'Chala. You could have an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan Chametz B'Shashishis. You could have an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan of a lower stripe, Chametz Nuksha. Never be an Isser Hana Midaraisa. Who, by the way, draws that distinction between the Shavs D'Rabbanan versus the Chafta D'Rabbanan, which Rishon that we saw explicitly. Know this for the identifications, please. For the Maharam Chalava. So, let's try to push this a little bit further. Where you're not only dealing with an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan, but what's the next step, the next frontier? The Torah didn't say this was Asr B'Hana, the rabbis didn't say this is Asr B'Hana, but who did?
The Ramos case of the Kahal.
The
Kahal.
Oh, the Kahal, okay, that's a good intermediate case, but even something a little more obvious, good Yehuda.
You shouldn't necessarily. Excellent.
Yehuda, outstanding. So what do we know about that? Should we equate that with an actual Isser Hana? The Meiri certainly does. Who else does? The Rashba. What does the Rashba say in the Tshuva? How is this any different than an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan? In both cases, what's the expression that he uses? Shlomi? Excellent. Bichdi lo mekanya nafsha. She has to be able to extract, it almost sounds Lubavitch, Hano'a mamish. They asked the Rebbe when Mashiach was coming. He said Bekarov. They said how soon? He said Bekarov mamish. Hano'a mamish. You have to be able to extract Hano'a mamish. Okay. Who may be in disagreement? Friedman thinks that this Rishon is in disagreement about this particular point, that there is no equation to be drawn between an Isser Hana, even an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan, and a Neder. Yaakov? Correct. And how do we know that?
He says
very good. He says, B'shah Shishis, this is an Isser Hana, Kevan Sha'asru B'Hana L'chol Yisrael. The reason that there's no Kiddushin is not because she personally cannot extract benefit. That's not our focus. The question is whether this is something that's in Isser Hana'a broadly, and that suggested interpretation of Isser Hana'a, not in the practical sense, can I get Hana'a, like the Rashba said, but in Isser Hana'a in the sense of something which loses its status of Mammon, pushing back in the direction of the Shiltei Giborim and the Ritva and the Meiri. That's only considered Davar She'eno Mammon when nobody can benefit from this, as opposed to you yourself cannot benefit from it. That's the argument that we tried to make within the Shita of the Tur. Okay. Now, in the Tshuva of the Rashba that we dealt with extensively, so the Rashba says he's dealing with an issue. Maybe we shouldn't relate to this as an Isser Hana Midivrayim, because what can she do? Not maf. You don't mafkir the neder. What do? You're show on your neder, or you're mafkia the neder, right? So just speak about that for a second, Yehuda. How did we analyze that? What was the svara that we brought to bear on that? Is it obviously she hasn't undone the neder yet, but the very fact that she could, what does that tell us, Avi?
That would never be undone.
Right. In other words, that vis-a-vis this individual, even if practically speaking, she can't extract hana, the very fact that she could may mean that it has a status of mammon relative to her. Okay, we see this. Give me a halachic analog, Shlomo, from Shas, where we see this, that even if...
Marvel and Azir and Shumli as well.
That's not the best one. Give me an analog to this, that she the very fact that she could be shoel renders it mammon. What does that remind you of? Where the very fact that you could do X means that we don't have to worry about whether or not you've done it. I'll start you. You finish Kol Harai.
Okay, we're the Bila and Bila Makavaspa.
Okay, good. So what does it mean?
Okay, meaning if you could do some things, then you don't necessarily have to do that b'poil.
So
okay.
What's the case of Kol Harai Bila and Bila Makavaspa?
Say like a mikvah. I mean, the actual case.
Yeah.
So like by the korban chatas, you have to like mix the.
So by karban mincha, you have to mix in shemen.
Mix in shaman.
Right. So the question is the shemen me'akev the karban? So the halacha is as long as the karban mincha, the amount of flour, is ra'oi to put shemen in, kol haroi lebila, you could mix it in, ein bila me'akeves bo. But if you've concocted in such a way that you couldn't possibly mix in the oil, so then the bila, the oil is me'akeves bo. So that's something similar to the svara that we explored here. The very fact that she could be shoel on this particular neder may diminish it from being an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan to something that we would consider mamon, and she could be miskadesh as bo. Okay, so those were some of the applications that we saw. Now, in terms of the Ramah, how does the Ramah paskin in this situation where she generates the Isser Hana? The Torah doesn't generate it. The rabbis don't generate it. Akiva, what's the Psak HaRamah? What's that? So the Ramah paskins that Isha Shenadra Hana, so Ein Choshesh in the Kiddushin. He paskins like the Rashba and the Meiri and the Sugya. But what does he add? Very important. Mesh?
That star is different.
Exactly right. That's only true when you're dealing with Kiddushay Kesef. But when you're dealing with Kiddushay Shtar, even if the Shtar is written on Davar Sha'asar Behana, that's immaterial. We're still Choshesh for Kiddushin in that particular case, because Kiddushay Shtar is not about her capacity to extract benefit. There is no issue of Bichdi Lo Mekanya Nafsha. That's based on a different kind of a kinyan. The kinyan is not affected through her capacity to derive hana from the chavtza shel kiddushin. The kinyan is affected by the shtar. That was a very important point that we saw in the Ramah. To be mechalik between kiddushay kesef and kiddushay shtar. Okay. Now, can one maintain, leading a question, especially for those mock trial, leading a question, can one be mechalik between psulei edim derabanan in kiddushin and psulei edim derabanan in gittin, in gerushin? Or if you say that psulei edim in kiddushin is going to be ma'akev the kiddushin on the daraisa level, the same is true of gerushin, or vice versa. Can you be mechalik? Tani? Excellent. And who says that explicitly? Who says that he feels that if there's a psulei derabanan in gittin, the get is valid daraisa, beautiful Tani, clean sweep, the Rashba. Excellent. So when it comes to gerushin, gito pasol aval eno batal. Fundamental distinction between gittin and kiddushin in terms of whether edim who are pasol midrabanan are going to undermine it on the status of a daraisa. Very good. Okay. Really just coming to the end here in terms of the Makoros that we saw. As we know, the Taz is cholek on the Mechaber. The Mechaber ends up paskening that if there is no tzad de'oraisa whatsoever, it's a pure din derabanan. In terms of the Yisra Hana, we're choshesh for Kiddushin. The Taz is cholek, the Beis Shmuel is cholek, the Avnei Miluim is cholek. But the Taz is perhaps the most innovative argument. Who remembers the basis of the Taz's argument? He says, he thinks when it comes to Kiddushin, even if there's no tzad daraisa, we shouldn't be choshesh for Kiddushin. He employs a very specific form of hefker based in hefker, but an application of hefker based in hefker that we haven't seen before. Normally we use hefker based in hefker to explain why this is no longer the rishus of the Mekadesh, and therefore in choshesh in the Kiddushin. But he uses a totally different situation. Avi, go ahead.
Putting somebody else's rishus.
Very good. What's the case?
that somebody acquires something through Dalit Amos and
Kinyan Dalit Amos, Kinyan Derabanan.
somebody else is caught via it through Doraisa.
So they have a Kinyan Doraisa, so that's, from a Doraisa standpoint, Gezel. You obviously can't be Mekadesh Shisha with something that you stole. Okay?
So the person did the Doraisa, Kenyan does Kedushin, but they're about to take it out of his control, put it in the person with Dalit Amos.
And there the Taz says, so Hachanami, if the rabbis can do that, so certainly, when they say something which is Asr Ba'ana Midrabanan, so they have the capacity to take it out of your Rishus on a Doraisa level. And so in the end, he's cholik on the Mechaber. He says, I don't think you need a Tzad Doraisa to say in Choshesh and the Kiddushin. And we compiled this very lengthy list of Rishonim and Achronim who do paskin that way. Likely Rashi, because Rashi seems to believe there is no Tzad Doraisa whatsoever. It's Sha'a Shishis. Sounds like he's talking about Chametz Derabanan. He doesn't use the words, but it sounds that way. Rabbeinu David, the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam in Mishnah Torah Hilchos Ishus Parakei Halacha Aleph according to the Maggid Mishnah and the Beis Yosef. Rabbeinu David, if we haven't mentioned it yet. A very lengthy list of Rishonim and Achronim who don't think that you need a Tzad D'Oraisa at all to impede the Kiddushin. On the other hand, the Psak of the Mechaber seems to reflect the Ran in our Sugya, where the Ran said that his reading of the Rambam and his reading of Rabbeinu Tam was that if there's no Tzad D'Oraisa, we will be Choshesh for Kiddushin. The Ran derived that from Rabbeinu Tam, and the Ran thought that was the perspective of the Rambam as well. Okay? So that really covers everything that we saw in terms of this particular Sugya. Any questions about Chitei Kordenaisa? Yaakov.
Yeah, just
Sure.
How does the Taz use in case of the Manaviyah?
Good question. So he says, let's try to understand the full impact of Hefker based in Hefker. Go back to the case. That bag of cereal that's near you, it's within your Dalit Amos. So let's just assume that's Hefker right now. So we would assume that it's yours, right? Midirabanan. Then Hillel, who's more than 4 Amos away, comes over and picks it up. So now he has a Kinyan Hagbah, he's the owner of this. You take the cereal back and you're Mekadesh a woman with it, everybody agrees that woman is Mekudeshes. Why? Hefker based in Hefker. They were Mafkir from Hillel's Rishus, they recognized your Rishus, the Kinyan Dalit Amos, the Kinyan Dirabanan. So the Taz says, if the rabbis can do that, they can actively take something out of Hillel's Rishus, put it into your Rishus for purposes of Kiddushin. So then the opposite situation is also true. When the Torah says, this is something that you can extract benefit from, the rabbis said that you can't. So why can't the rabbis override the Torah and to say, this is not within your financial portfolio, Heim Hifkiru Mamono, and therefore there's no basis for Kiddushin. This is Mamon, the Chavtza Kiddushin, but it's not your Mamon. It's just any kind of an Isser D'Rabbanan, Isser Hana D'Rabbanan, irrespective of whether or not there was a D'Oraisa. So just take an Isser Hana D'Rabbanan. The Torah says this isn't Yerushas. The rabbi said it's not. So the rabbis obviously have the power to take something away from the Torah-sanctioned owner, right? As in the case of the Kinyan Dalit Amos, so they can take it away from you. Even though the Torah says you're the owner of this object, the rabbi said you're not. There's an Isra Hana D'Rabbanan. So why should we be Choshesh for Kiddushin? How is that any different? The case of the Kinyan Dalit Amos. So in the case of Kinyan Dalit Amos, there are 2 people involved. Here there's only 1 person involved, but the same concept. Torah says you're the owner. The rabbi said, oh, you're not. So Hefker based in Hefker works in one direction. It should work in the other direction too. Mark?
Don't you also explain the problem is called the Makadesh? Don't they agree that it functions either either because it takes out your issues or because it devalues it?
No, not necessarily.
Then at the end of the day,
Rashi does, but
at the end
the Rashba doesn't.
what's the issue they're doing that? What's it's not their Rabbanan standard? It's not their Rabbanan standard, then they don't consider it kasa.
You're impacted. Your sense of Kol Mekadesh is deeply influenced by Rashi. It's not a bad thing. But think about it this way. Right? Come to the customs office. Passport control. So you, Mark Gottesman, you have identification, you have a passport, it's not expired. There's a guy in the booth. All the elements are in place. He's not claiming this isn't your passport. He's not saying you're not Mark Gottesman. He's not saying that the chefza is expired. He just won't give you the stamp.
And that stamp has to come from something.
It's not an attack on the chefza shel kiddushin. It's not an attack on the connection between the chefza shel kiddushin and the mekadesh. It's not an attack on the Isha Mikudashas. It's an override mechanism. See, that's the difference between the way that Rashi and the Rashba conceptualized the role here called the Mekadesh Adais the Roman Mekadesh. For Rashi, what you're saying is absolutely correct. That called the Mekadesh Adais the Roman Mekadesh means now the rabbis have been put on alert, and like a bunch of firemen who swing down the pole, once they put an alert, so then they say, Hefker based in Hefker, we got to take away the man's mammon. That's not how the Rashba learns. V'haraya kiddushay bi. The masha bilosa bilas nos. They're not saying that there wasn't a ma'isa bia. They're saying that the bia didn't create kiddushin. They can't deny there was bia. There's forensic evidence. But what they can deny is that bia created the kiddushin. Question is whether the kiddushin is chal, and so as an override mechanism. So what do you call it when man and woman had many bios, but not in the context of ishus? How do we refer to that? Bilas nos. That's the idea. Is that they hold the key to the kingdom in their hands. Called the mekadesh, adaisa deraban and mekadesh. The Meiri didn't believe that. That's why he says hey chadet maritmar. He doesn't understand. To a great extent, when you're talking now, I hear the Meiri's voice. Hey chadet maritmar. We can't relate to it. If you have the component parts, what are they going to do? This is not Catholicism. We don't believe in some ecclesiastical privilege. So called the Mekadesh, Adais the Rabban Mekadesh, according to the Rashba, which is really presented as a separate reason, is the incredible power to take a situation where all the component parts are in place and almost, through executive order, just say, sorry. We don't approve of these kiddushin. Now, they can't do this willy-nilly. There needs to be some Issa D'Rabbanan involved, whether it's Shnios La'arayos, whether it's Eidim Psulim D'Rabbanan, whether it's an Issa Hana D'Rabbanan. But that need not mean that the mechanism is to say Hefker based in Hefker. So Mark, as you inexorably are on the path to become part of that elite cadre, in terms of Kol Mekadesh Adaisa D'Rabbanan, Mark, Adaisa the Mark Mekadesh. So that's power that you're going to have to treat responsibly. When we learn Kiddushin next year, we'll have much time to reflect on this issue. Much time to reflect on this issue. Rashi, Mark, was so convinced of your approach. That's ultimately why called the Mekadesh Adais the Rabbanan Mekadesh is just a Hechi Timtzi to get to the Hefker based in Hefker. it has to lead to that. Otherwise, what are they doing? Mr. Rosenfeld, Senator.
In that light,
You have
what
10
was-
minutes.
Sorry?
Is this going to be some kind of like confirmation hearing process?
I don't think so.
I'm in favor of sanctions against Russia, if that's what you're asking.
I'm not sure I'm in favor, depending on how we will be. What would Russia say in Bia?
That's a good point.
Does he say that coal does he apply that also to Bia like process?
Rashi? No.
I think it's a Gemara that.
The Gemara deals with it. The Rashba quotes it. The question is, you'd have to chart out Rashi in all of those cases. Whether Rashi actually employs that.
Whether he has an functional mechanism in those cases, or if it's
Correct.
or if he concedes in this business.
Correct. Just let me.
So in terms of the Milchamos explaining Shitas or Shimon,
Yeah.
so in the chart it says that he holds that there's no Nisr Hano.
Yeah, just like the Balei Tosos, right?
Right. So
And just like Rabbeinu David.
I thought you quoted the Balamor's reasoning that Umishashu Asavakil Asmana is also a legal Rabbi Shimon, except that he only has an Isser Derabana of Hana.
So that's the right. The Ramban circles back and says the truth is that when you're in the process of destroying it, just like the Balei Tosos, the only reason that he thinks you can't get Hana is Gzera Shema Yochlenu. So in the end of that piece, I think you get the impression that it's not that there's a formal Isser Hana, but Shlomi ultimately it doesn't matter, because the very fact that you have to destroy it, Rafi, this was your contribution from last year, that ultimately the very fact that you have to destroy it, it's not a bar kiyuma, means that it's not subject to being the Chavta Shel Kiddushin. Yaakov.
What's the basis for Rabbi saying there's no Isser Hana?
Right. So there's two ways of assessing that. Now, again, the Gemara was able to show you how all the psukim were understood by Rabbi Yossi Aglili. There are really 3 points that need to be made. According to Rabbi Aval, anytime there's an Isser Achila, there's an implied Isser Hana. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili obviously doesn't subscribe to that. Number one. Number two. What is the nature of the Isser Chametz? So if you say it's for 7 days a year, it's ma'achalos asuros. It's a nevela. Nevela is mater b'hana. Chametz is mater b'hana. Third, there's a possibility that I was alluding to before, that he even agrees that there's an Isser Chavtza involved. He doesn't deny Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh. Can't possess it. So there is an Isser that adheres to the Chavtza. The Chavtza is Ne'asar. But for Rabbi Yossi Aglili, doesn't translate into an Isser Hanoah. No. It's almost sui generis, right, Yaakov? You put all the pieces together. There's Isser Achil, there's Isser Bal Yirah Bal Yimatzeh, there's a Chiyav Tashbisu, and yet there's no Isser Hanoah. I'd like to try to explain it on the basis of Tosfos' line. When Tosfos says, "How do I know that Rabbi Shimon subscribes to an Isser Achila?" He says, "Tashbisu shelo kederach hana'aso dahainu achila." And then Tosfos, by the way, himself says, and he thinks that this could apply to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So basically, if you want to take the approach that it is an Isser Chavtza, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it's not just the Gavra can't eat it and the Gavra can't possess it, but there is something Aser about this Chavtza, that's why you can't possess it. It could very well be that extracting Hanoah from Chametz, Rabbi Yossi Aglili does not consider that to be an actual engagement with the Chavtza. It's not really engaging with the Chavtza. When you eat it, it certainly is. When you possess it, it certainly is. But benefiting from Chametz doesn't cross that threshold. So there's almost nothing like it. You're not going to find a parallel in the entire universe of halacha. Something that you must destroy, tashbis, is something that you cannot possess. Ba'ira, ba'imatzeh, something that you cannot eat, but something that if you derive benefit from it, that wouldn't formally be aser. Again, there would be the yisra aseh of tashbisu, but that wouldn't formally be aser. And I think what I meant by quoting that Tosfos is shelo kederach hana'asa. That what is a derech to get hana'ah from food is to eat it. This is the hainu achila. So that when it's almost like kila achar yad, the shelo kederach. That we're dealing with food, and the only engagement is engagement of hana'ah. That may not cross the threshold in terms of engaging that particular chavza.
What would you say about the case of using food?
Yeah, so Tosfos said that he thought that Rabbi Yossi Aglili would have the same problem with that Shema Yochlanu. He said he thought that he'd have to get destroyed right away because he too would be nervous about eating it. Not eating it because he subscribes to a law of Kodem Zmano, but just because of the Isra Aseh of Tashbisu. Tosfos thought that Rabbi Yossi Aglili would agree to that. That would be a point of agreement, overlap between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Any further questions on Chitei Cord Naisa? Anything that was unclear from the Sugya? Jacob.
Do you see anywhere else where there's no Isser Hana, but still shouldn't show because the Torah seems to discourage it?
Still shouldn't do what?
You shouldn't derive benefit because, we have tashbisu, so so we shouldn't eat it because...
Not really. The only two things that have to be destroyed are chametz and avodah zara, right? And avodah zara is laden with multiple levels of isurei hana d'oraisa. That's the challenge here. That's the challenge. Rafi.
Is this whole discussion of particular mass contribution, is it all put together? Because I feel like if you're discussing the before it's done, you just say it's very murky, so avoid the problem altogether.
Yeah, so that was what even the Balamor said that. L'chatchila, you shouldn't have been, masha l'chametz lach chatzos.
So all of these Rishonim are discussing at the end.
Right, but there's still great. The lumdus is still equally profound, and there's still a great deal at stake. Whether a get is required or not. Jacob.
Do all of the Rishonim agree on what the differences are?
No. Remember, we saw many different
Reasons why they have
yes.
and that is linked to different
Right. Of what it is. Dahavi chametz nuksha, dahavi kich chametz nuksha, chametz kashin me'od. Right, I can't point out enough times here. Rashi doesn't actually say chametz derabana, and he just says chametz that it's hard for it to become chametz. I think I pointed out to you at the time we were reading the Maram Chalaba's own personal rendering of that, how impressed I am by the Rishonim that they had an opinion about this subject. Right? Like, how could I possibly know what, it's very impressive. They had mastery of fields of knowledge. Yehuda and I were talking about yesterday, when the bracha v'atachon l'adam das, and I said in a lot of ways, these artificial bifurcations between Torah knowledge and general knowledge, right? So, whether you think Chitei Kornaisa is Chametz D'Rabbanan and Chametz D'Oraisa has a lot to do with how much you know about botany. So, hard to distinguish. Okay, gentlemen, Godspeed. So what's going on now?
I'm free until 2:30.
What do you guys have now?
I have math. No, so I have physics.
All I know is that
What do you for my midterm?
all I know is that I'm free till my 2:30 midterm.
What midterm do you have today?
I have statistics.
Oh, okay.
I have minutes at
Gemara midterm is at. The Gemara midterm is at what time?
9:30.
9:30 a.m. Okay.
So we don't have anything.
I don't have it. I don't know.
Okay, very good. Did anybody not get the Chazara sheet that I put together?
Also, will you be coming in the morning? Will you be davening at TABC?
I have to ask Mr. Playoff about that. If they need me, I'm happy to do it. Otherwise, I'll go to the shul because they need me there.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's I still haven't figured that out. I'm going to ask Mr. Playoff now.
I saw it. The midterm is what's ours?
Yeah, so the midterm is 20 identifications, 8 short answer questions with 5 points each, and then 2 paragraph length answers. So 20 points of IDs, 40 points of short answers.